Hello, 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 Barnes & Noble Book Club members. It's really great to see everyone jumping into the chat already. We have lots of folks from all over, and this is so great. So, couple of things before we start. I'm here with Shannon DeVito, Director of Books for Barnes & Noble, Gabrielle Zevin, the Woman of the Hour, and I'm Miwa Messer. I'm the producer and host of Poured Over. But a couple of things before we start. There will be spoilers in this conversation. There will be spoilers. I am desperate to talk to Gabrielle about some stuff that we did not get to talk about when she was on Poured Over a while ago. So just know, please, that spoilers are coming. The other thing is, too, we love to see questions in the chat. We love to see questions in the Q&A module. If you don't know how to use the Q&A module, it's the bottom of the screen. Just hover your mouse over the bottom, and you'll see the Q&A, and you can drop questions in. And Pam Gardo has got us off to a great start, which is awesome. Thank you. And Pam, I will get to your question. We don't like to hold questions until the end of the show. So just know that if you submitted questions when you registered for the event, or you're dropping in questions during the chat as we go and into the Q&A module as we go, I will get to them as I can, but there are a lot of questions. Oh, there are so many questions, but you know what? I want to start with the thing that I know already, but I know Gabrielle doesn't, and I know you in the audience don't know. But Shannon, why did we pick tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow for book club?
To say when I read this, and Gabrielle, I cannot tell you how excited I am to be having this conversation, especially if it's going to include spoilers and we can talk about the end and the growth. To say that I've been obsessed with this book since I read it would be the understatement of the season. I've been yelling about this book to everyone at work because I just love the friendship, the growth, the layers of love and the different kinds of love we have in our life and how we come together and apart, the threads of gaming. There's just so many different entry points to what this book is. And I think that that's what makes it so special and such a work of art in different ways. And it's just perfect for book club. So that's why I mean, there was no other choice. We had to for the month of July, and we did. So now we get to have this conversation.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, and there are lots of folks actually. There's Larissa and Alex, and I'm going to use this to bridge into Pam's first question. But what made you, Gabrielle, write this story about these people and gaming and love and loss and Los Angeles? Because let's face it, you know, Cambridge has its moment, but you've written an LA novel.
I think I have written an LA novel, and it's weird because I had read about LA before I'd even moved here. And I think my idea of LA and everyone's idea of LA is so formed from like cultural representations of it that you move to actually LA and you have your own LA and you find yourself wanting to write about that. So I'd lived in LA about 10 years. In the end, I think it is a Cambridge, Massachusetts novel. I feel just as much there. And I will say I felt because I started writing this in the beginning of 2018, but I wrote a large part of it during the pandemic. And, you know, I can see in this book something different than my other books, which is a real like sensual depiction of cities. And I think that's because, you know, when you can't travel, you can travel when you write. And so I can see like these are all places from my life, all places that I've lived, you know, Los Angeles, Cambridge, Massachusetts. My parents lived in Austin, Texas for a bit, a little bit of San Francisco, Tokyo, Japan, where I've worked, New York City, you know, and so it's all written with a great deal of love and longing for places I couldn't go and people I couldn't talk to, you know, but why video gaming? You know, I think, you know, we talked about it. The first generation of people who play video games as children are now turning into their late 40s and 50s. And I think when you have video games as a kind of primary storytelling thing in your life, it actually changes how you see the world. And so that interested me to tell a coming of age story of artists that went right alongside the coming of age of an industry. I think we know that tech has changed our lives, but in so many of the way these changes are just like completely invisible to us. But when you look at the history of video games, you can actually visually see a change that sometimes just feels almost secretive in a way. You can see that Pong, which is literally 2 lines and 2 dots, becomes The Last of Us, which looks like a movie. And so all of these things were interesting to me. I think you can tell the history of bread making, the history of wine, and you can have a secret history of the last 30 years of what it is to be a person and an artist in America, you know?
And it's funny, Miwa, that honing in on the LA part. And I'm Cleveland, Chicago, and New York. So very like East Coast. And I felt it was very bi-coastal East Coast. Like I love that I could get the feeling that I was in LA, even though I have never been there. And the accuracy of the East Coast city and the grunge and the magic eye that you see, and like that really kind of put you in the environment immediately. And then the gaming layered on top of that really visceral kind of cityscape that felt like its own character.
Well, it's weird. I think sometimes I haven't wanted to lean into writing real places as much, but for this, I think because so much of the book is a conflict between like the imaginary worlds that Sam and Sadie attempt to create and the actual world they live in, all the real things I wanted to be like palpably real and incredibly like sensual,
Okay, I'm also making fun of Cambridge because I grew up outside of Cambridge. So some of us know that red line station that you were referring to, my friend. Some of us spent quite a lot of time there. But I wanted to go back to something that Pam Gardow asked. Was this always the title? Can you talk about the process of deciding on the title and why this was chosen? Because I think this sets us up for a really important piece of storytelling.
Yeah, it was always the title, but there wasn't a title for a while. I actually like to start my books knowing a sense of what the ending is going to be. It doesn't have to be that ending, but I like to know that I could land the plane some way. And I like to have a sense of a title. And I did not have a title for this book until I was at least 25% of the way through. It was basically called Untitled Gaming Novel, which actually makes you feel terrible when you go look at it every day in your document, but at a certain point, it became the title. And, obviously the title comes from Macbeth's Act 5 soliloquy in Shakespeare. It's one of the bleakest speeches in all of Shakespeare. And yet the character who invokes it in my novel, who is Marx, finds great hope in it. Of course, he is in salesman mode. I always need to tell people this. He's trying to sell them on the idea that they should name their company Tomorrow Games. So he actually finds hope in this strangely bleak speech. And also conveniently for me, a metaphor for video games with their infinite lives and chances at redemption.
I want to talk about 3 of my favorite humans that I've ever encountered on the page. Because I love Sam and I love Sadie and I love Marx, even when they're making me a little crazy. Because let's face it, you brought these folks to life in a way that not everyone can do on the page. And I got a little invested. And, all of us know, having experienced this book, that this is kind of more a novel about love and loss than it is about gaming. Like the gaming stuff is great because it's just another form of storytelling. And we're going to get to that part of the conversation, but we have to start with Sam and Sadie and Marx and how you came to them. So would you tell folks the story of how this novel started for you? Because it started with character and it kind of started with Sam.
It started a little bit with concept but you have concepts all the time and you don't have anything until you have character, so like for me, a problem isn't finding an idea, it's finding something that is going to like be alive in some way and animate itself, so for me, Sam and Sadie were born at almost the same time, but Sam was born slightly before Sadie. He appeared first and had a name first, so I have to say he was probably the first one in. And, for me, so much of Sam it's the first time I've ever written a half Jewish, half Korean character. Mm-hmm. I am a half Jewish, half Korean character myself. And, I think a lot of his dilemma comes from the fact that he feels like he is a part of nothing. He's a part of these 2 cultures. And yet that kind of makes him a part of no culture. And so I think in a way he uses games so much to find identity. And just a lot of Sam came from my experiences with race, and obviously Sadie, she is a person who doesn't have, Sam's ethnic identity, but a way that I personally quite relate to Sadie is in terms of what it is to be a woman in the arts. And I think, that's so much of Sadie's story, like how difficult it is and how rigorous you have to be and how ambitious you have to be if you want to get something done that is big when you are in a female body, and so that's where Sam and Sadie kind of came from. For me, that's like, I guess they're more like larger drives. And in the end, like in the end, when I think about them, it's much more simple than that. It's the story of these like 2 kids who like to play games together and then decided to make games together,
And Shannon, do you have a favorite?
Yeah,
who's your favorite? Yeah,
I was just gonna bring him up. Mm-hmm. because for me, I'm completely invested in Sadie and Sam and how they intertwine over the 3 decades. But I was shocked by how much I fell in love with Marx and his character, and how devastated I was when
I was
he
so
was no
mad.
longer with us.
I was so mad. I was so
he-
mad.
He's the one, like, speaking about, looking at the optimistic side of things, and taking a speech from Macbeth and looking at the positives, which is one of the darkest places in the history of ever.
Yeah.
I think he just wants friendship and love, and to foster, like, he's a very good salesman, because I think he can read people and see to the heart of things kind of immediately. And I respect that so much in people, whether it be a character on the page, or a real person, but he felt so real to me. So he's definitely, he was like my sleeper favorite. Halfway through, I was like, why am I in love with this man? So it's Marx.
But also, Marx is Sadie and Sam's gaming engine. He is their entire working relationship, even their interpersonal relationships to a certain extent. Marx is their gaming engine entirely, which is a phrase I did not know until I read this book. But
Yeah,
I want to talk about throwing Marx in. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I feel like, the thing is, for me, and I'm going to speak about the character, like outside the character for a second, which just to say that, for me, so much of Marx is all the people in a creative process that aren't like typically what you'd call creatives, all the people who work on a book whose names aren't on a book is the shorthand for me, but I just want to say that I think Marx is incredibly creative. At a certain point in the story, he actually figures out how to solve a lot of their kind of artistic problems, creatively, like with regard to the pivot from both sides into Maple World. This is all Marx, and so I just wanted to show how important a creative business person is in a process. It's something, when I started out as a novelist, I didn't think about it all. I didn't think about like how a book ended up in a store, who was going to tell people to read it, why it was good, how a jacket got there. All I thought about was just like the book. But in fact, there's so many things outside the book. And so much of that Marx came from wanting to write about all the people that I really love and value in my own creative process. And that was Marx, and I feel like for Sadie, to speak now in narratively, she, starts out so resistant to him for obvious reasons. She calls him like the kind of rich kid, who has a lot of skills and interests, who has a lot of interests, but very few skills. But as I think, she becomes more interested in him, as he becomes a more formidable person in terms of showing how creative he is and how important he is to them. So anyway, and I also always want to point out to people that like Sam and Marx are just as intimate as Sadie and Marx are.
Yeah. Yes. Their relationship felt so visceral immediately, because one of the first scenes is them playing Sadie's game together. You're like, this is even when they're not super connected yet. And I think it really is, he's the master of the art side of things, the master of the business of art, which is like you kind of see the creative faces, and that's what you identify things with. But there's so much, especially in today's day and age and a digital product, so much can be about kind of the business side that needs to get that product out and about. And he was just so good at it.
And in the end, when he, since this is a spoiler conversation, when he's gone, they are really lost without him. If Sadie is art and Sam is commerce, Marx really is art and commerce,
Can we go back to the boys for a second? Because the thing is, they meet as roommates, and Marx obviously comes from a very comfortable background. Sam does not. No. And Marx goes and buys Sam a coat, but doesn't really tell him he's buying it for him. He's like, I'm just going to leave it in the bag here. And Sam ultimately says, can I have that? That kind of delicate moment, right? Marx knows that Sam doesn't want his help, but Marx can't watch his roommate walk around in Massachusetts in the winter without a coat. Like, no one could watch
with a members only jacket, right? He needs
it doesn't
warmer.
But we don't often talk about men's friendships. We talk about rivalries and, whether it's business rivalries or love rivalries or everything else, they start from a genuine place of friendship. And I'm not entirely sure that Unfair Games ever could have existed without Marx.
No, I don't think so. He's
Yeah.
capital. He does he does all these, he does taxes, he does
Right.
tasks, he does everything to he figures out how to sell this and how they're going to, and the things they need to do, so I think, Marx is just invaluable. And I will say, in terms of writing characters, until I had the moment at the coat right at the beginning, I really didn't, I just followed that. I was like, why is this character Sam wearing a coat that's too big? And in a way, it's sort of how you end up writing a character. You follow, where did this coat come from? Why is it big? Why didn't he just buy a coat that was the right size? And so that was kind of the first things I knew about Marx and Sam was particularly how that coat came to be Sam's coat,
So we have these three characters. They're the heart. Absolutely the heart of the story. But, one of the great joys of reading a novel is capturing the passage of time and experiencing the passage of time. So I want to go back and talk about structure for just a second, because here you are, we're in the present, we're flashing back, and then you're even sort of flashing back within a flashback as we learn, Sam's backstory, and as we learn how Sam and Sadie meet, which, it's clever. It's really clever how they meet. I don't think I've ever read anything like that before in a novel like this. So can we just talk about structure and how you're working through, because there needs to be a payoff emotionally.
Right.
I'm not sure you knew when Marx was going to meet his demise, and I suspect you knew earlier than I might like to admit, but let's talk about structure for a second.
For me, I feel, because I have written quite a few novels, more willing to experiment and more willing to be lost in a structure, more willing to just, allow time to pass. Well, so it's like you write in two ways. You write with an eye to what is going to happen, but you also keep yourself in a present moment to allow for things that could happen, and so I have felt more comfortable being in that sort of, just an unclear space, I guess, in a more vague space than I ever was before with regard to this book. I wanted to tell a book that took place over a large span of time. To me, because now, I'm hitting middle age, I was really interested in the ways in which the things that I thought, even when I first published a novel 17 years ago, but especially back when I was in college, I'm a little bit younger than Sam and Sadie, but about their age, just how so many of the things that I thought as fixed were not fixed.
Mm-hmm.
And, the only way you can kind of show that is with a long span of time. I think I felt more confident with this book that if sometimes I lost a reader here or there, I felt more confident that most of them would follow me. And that it was okay for people to not understand every moment, or to live in moments where they did not particularly understand exactly what was happening in that way. And so just kind of this confidence that you get, again, from having written quite a few novels. And I will say, and I think I've said it to you before, I'm not sure, but basically just knowing that when you write a book, the only thing that is certain is that at some point your readers will misunderstand you. That's the only thing I know. At some point, a reader will take some message from a book that is not the one you intended. Once you know this, it's kind of peaceful to know this, because it means you can be bolder in terms of what you do with time or character or anything else,
Okay, Shannon, I have a question for you, but I want to drop in two questions because they really relate to Marx and what we've been talking about. Patrizia Chiappa, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Also, I am not wearing my reading glasses as I do this. Was it hard to write the end of Marx's character? Did you always know it was going to end that way for him? He was my favorite, and it was very hard to let him go.
I did not always know that he would end exactly that way. I knew that somebody would be gone. And in my earliest notes for the book, somebody else dies. And it's not Marx, to tell you the truth.
Was it Sadie or Sam?
So it seems weird to talk about the fact that just to say, I don't know everything when I begin a novel. But in fact, wrote, one of the earliest things I wrote that I didn't end up using was a scene in a future setting in which Sam was no longer with us, you know.
Right.
So I never really knew anyone that well when I was doing it. I just had a sense that if you tell a story in which sort of like the infinite lives and the lack of mortality of a video game character is important, you're going to need to actually show the mortality of a human being at some point, you know. And so no, I did not necessarily know until I knew Marx quite well, and I knew that his death would mean something, that I was going to ruthlessly murder him. But I didn't find it hard when I got there. You know, somebody asked me recently if I cried while I wrote, and I didn't cry. I have cried in the past, but I just felt so like intensely engaged in what was happening that it wasn't hard. It just felt like inevitable in a way. So.
It was. Kathleen Bender says in the chat that she didn't realize how much she loved Marx until he was gone. And I do wonder if I feel that way about him too. And because the pain in Sadie and Sam, I also felt. So it's almost easier for me to pick him as the favorite of the three because he was just so important and good to everyone. And
right.
So it was very effective.
Yeah, you know, I always say to people that he's the character that is the least like me, you know. So when somebody comes up to me and they say, oh, he's like definitely my favorite, I'll be like, well, that's great, because I'm not at all like him in any way. But in a way, it's actually great to write a character that's not like yourself. At some point, I realized that I didn't need to write characters to like approve of me. You know, my characters don't need to like me in any way, you know. And so writing Marx felt very comfortable because he's so much more optimistic about things. You know, he's a little bit like, again, the people in my life that I rely on to be more optimistic than I am. I think of like, you know, my agent, or, you know, just my partner, a great book editor, all these people that have kind of just like, their eye on the future in a way that when you're an artist, you don't have your eye on that future, you know. And so I definitely, I loved writing him because he's a break from myself, because I'm not always, you know, great to be with.
Okay, but I want to come to Sam and Sadie for a second, because we need to talk about their relate. I mean, it is possible to love people and not end up in a relationship with them. And I always sort of felt like they were never going, that they had this sort of epic love story, but it wasn't meant to be them in a little house with a picket fence and dogs and cats and children. It just, and I mean, certainly Sadie comes out and says that to Sam, but he's being a boy. He doesn't quite understand that there are levels to love. And that, I think, that along with Sam saying, I'm a halfie and therefore everything is busted. As a halfie, I wanted to take him aside and be like, oh, sweetie, no, that's not how this works. That's just not how this works. We get to draw from lots of stuff.
Right. You know, so it's funny because I think it's only that Sadie greatly, so I wanted to write in Sadie somebody who has an active and healthy sex life, an active and healthy sex drives, you know. And so I think like for her, it wouldn't mean that much to sleep with Sam, but she realized it would mean a great deal to Sam, you know. And so I think she's quite cautious about that. And when I look at Sam, even when he's claiming that he is very hurt by the fact that Sadie and Marx end up together, he doesn't actually want the things that Sadie and Marx have. He just wants to be the most important person in Sadie's life. And that's not the same thing at all, you know.
And his character too, he just wants to be important to people. He's so raw and he's so
he's so looking for this validation. And so is Sadie in a way. They seek validation for different ways, you know. But I think he wants, especially with Sadie, he cares so much about what she thinks. And I think he kind of resents the idea that the world would possibly see Marx as more important to Sadie than he is, you know, even though obviously the world doesn't see that. Nobody in the world is saying like Sadie and Marx, you know. That's just in their small world that is true. You know, and I actually think it's very practical of Sadie to not want to be with Sam in any way. You know, as she says, lovers are common, you know, but like
Mhm.
true collaborators in life are rare, you know.
Mhm.
So Douglas Stewart has a question. When writing the novel, did you ever feel pressure to make Sadie and Sam's relationship veer into the romantic, which we sort of addressed, but did you know definitely from the start that it would never go that way?
You know, I was open to whatever happened, I think, but I think there was a part of me that was very drawn to the idea that we are new kinds of people craving new kinds of stories. You know, I think certainly I was raised on the kinds of love stories that ended with marriage and children. You know, I even have a friend who wrote a book recently who, like, the editor said, like, but can't she end with a baby? She needs to be pregnant at the end for us to feel good. And so I'm saying this still happens today. You know, so I think from my point of view, I very much wanted to write a story that defied some of that. I think the book is actually, you know, it's funny, people say it's not a romance, and I totally know what that means, but I also think the book is quite romantic. It's just about a romance of making things, a
Mm-hmm.
romance of
Mm-hmm.
the mind. You know, a book like Possession, for instance,
Yep.
has like a great sort of intellectual romance in it. And that's what I wanted to show, how very, like, I guess, romantic the creative process can be, you know, and how much, again, Sadie and Sam basically do have a marriage. You know, Sadie
Mm-hmm.
has two marriages, but she has, you know, at least two marriages, but they really do have a marriage. But no, you know, so I didn't, I think I've gotten to a place where I don't as much have a horse in, as crazy as this is. I'm willing to let my characters be characters and not so much push a particular message of something that I want. Though inevitably, you know, the book reflects a lot of the things that I believe. So,
So we have a question from Tara, and Tara, I'm going to squint at your last name, and I'm really sorry if I mess it up. Scipion, I think. I love what this book says about cultural appropriation. Ask her to speak to that, please. So can we talk about, I mean,
whoa,
Ichiro, there's a lot. There is so much
there's a
ground to talk
lot.
about. There's a lot. But if we look at all of the influences on that first game, right, Ichiro,
Mhm.
you've got Dickens, you've got Chuck Close, the painter, you've got plenty of Western bit, the
You do.
Odyssey, the Iliad, all of this. But there's also a lot of Japan.
There's a
And,
lot of Japan and
hi.
not a Japanese person in sight except Marx, you know.
Right.
Um, you know, to me, I thought that was interesting. And so they're in 1995, and the word appropriation never occurs to anyone.
Hmm.
And so much of that to me was, as we were speaking about before, this long span of time where you could find yourself on the wrong side of an issue just because you've lived long enough, you know. You know, for me, I felt, sometimes people will ask me, do I feel exactly as Sam feels, in that sort of future interview that he gives at one point? I don't feel exactly as Sam feels. You know, Sam feels as Sam feels. You know, so from my point of view, I felt particularly well positioned for the first time in my life to maybe speak to an issue because of who I was. You know, to me, being biracial has never been anything that I found particularly interesting about myself. Certainly wasn't anything, but in this one sense, in this one time, it gave me a way to speak about something, because I was part of two cultures and could see maybe a little bit something different than other people could see or feel or even say right now. You know, so that was what was interesting to me about that. I I feel like so many writers get in trouble when they speak about these things. So I guess I'll just end there.
Okay. But this does also raise Dove,
Yeah, it
Sadie's
does.
professor, who she has an affair with, who, not the first time that's ever happened in literature, not the first time it's happened in real life. I personally, as a human being, would like to punt Dove into the sun. That's just me. But we need to talk about that power dynamic, because that is how their company gets off the ground. Sadie is completely bowled over by this dude and his charisma and his experience. I mean, we've all been in situations, I think, where there's, technically an adult in the room where you're just kind of like, oh, wow. And this turns into, hey, I'm living with you. Hey, I need a favor.
Right.
Hey, I mean, Dove is a man of his time. So can we talk about how he walked into your book? Because we need him. I get it. We need him for story purposes. I get
I
it.
mean, I have a million things I could say about Dove, and I feel
Hmm.
like it's hard to even know where to begin with him. But
Hmm.
the first thing I want to say is that I have had young people or people younger than myself ask me, why isn't Dove punished? And I'm like, well, the book ends in 2012. So he would have been basically good until 2017,
Yep.
as long as you kind of walked a narrow line, you could maybe, and he is really careful, actually. He makes a point of saying, I didn't sleep with you while you were still my student, so he's like in a gray area the whole time. But I also just think he is only, a thing to mention is that he's only attracted to Sadie when he decides that she's talented. He doesn't just want to sleep with any undergraduate. And she does actually benefit from her relationship to him. She benefits professionally. She benefits in terms of the sharing of his knowledge and her access. And so I wanted to depict how complicated these relationships could be, so he ends up kind of, again, wedded to her career forever, because of these things. And I think it is actually quite inconvenient for her that that's so, and yet she definitely benefits from that. And that's what I wanted to write about, just how, especially looking at it from the point of view of today, I could see the ways in which she benefited and the ways in which she, her life was definitely compromised by having this relationship that way,
But again, this goes back to the way we cover time in a novel, right? I mean, the world was not the world it is that we live in right now as this book is being published.
Right.
And I think that's
not the world we live
right?
in. And I think sometimes we write things that way, even if you'll be reading like say a historical novel, and it seems as if like it's depicting the people in some ways if they were born old, they were always old, but in fact, that's just not, that's not true. We cannot, fiction cannot be predictive in that sense. So if you're in 1995, you have to truly embrace the ethos of 1995, if you know what I mean. So yeah. And by the way, you're like, you're saying Dove needs to get like kicked into the ocean, and he probably does. We don't know why he's left MIT at the end of the book. There's not a lot of information given about where he has gone or why he's returned to Israel all of a sudden to like take care of his family, his 16-year-old son. We don't know what's happened to Dove,
It's true. And I do like that open ending. That's my shorthand for saying I was living in your book and I got a little emotionally attached to the story. Hey, Shannon, do you have a favorite moment from Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow? Like a moment that you're just going to carry, or it is tattooed on the back of your brain, you're going to carry it around with you?
It's one of the first, actually, because it's what made me read the whole thing in a day and a half, is when they meet in the hospital. And I could read, there's something about kids in hospitals. And if you have personal experience or if you don't, you can just kind of read the pain that's in him. And the genuine just interest from just Sadie, and the fact that they could just connect on just one small thing, which is how friendships are built. It's one small thing, or an affinity, or a book you like, or a game, or a play you watched, or you both like the same type of
right. It's so true. Friendship is so difficult and yet very simple.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems like impossibly, especially as you get older, it seems like it can't just be enough that we both liked this book, but it actually can be enough that we both liked this book.
Yes, it really, them meeting and playing the game together was that doorway to this epic relationship that defined both of their lives. And that's what kept me reading the entire book, because I was immediately so invested with both of them as children, and I needed to see how they grew together, and like what was going to happen and how they were going to, change each other over the course of their lives from this one thing that they connected on. So I just, that for me was really at the beginning. And then I also love the bookend, and, there's so many different parts I can call out and just say the way it's written is just heartbreakingly effective. But I think because that beginning scene really just threw me into the deep end and put me in that place of a bit of terror. Children in hospitals, it's just, you can really feel it.
It's funny because I was drawn to writing about the hospital because I knew this would be about like the perfectly working body of a video game character and the imperfect human body that Sam has. And, I think that's like a large part to understand what his attraction is to video games. But I also wanted to write about the hospital. I said it to Miwa on the podcast because, I think health is a great equalizer in society, so there are ways in which, like, say, somebody of Sadie's background and Sam's background just would not meet unless they were meeting somewhere like a hospital. Like, illness is a common denominator that rises above class. Very few things do, and so I wanted to think about that. I was always thinking about how much of their lives and what happens to them was determined by how much money they had from birth. And so that was such a thing that I kept factoring. And so that's why when I would think it through, the place they were going to meet was the hospital, and coming from these very, again, different backgrounds and different reasons for being there.
I'm just keeping an eye on the clock because I knew this was going to happen, that we would just gallop into the conversation. But Pam Garda has another question. As you were inventing the games, were there games you invented and liked but didn't use? I love how the games layered meaning into the novel. Was that part of the criteria for them?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely I invented the games as I went. It was a kind of convoluted process that involved something I wanted to show, which is how much, when I write a book, it's determined by the things that are happening in my life and how that kind of becomes fiction, the way it transforms. So I wanted it to always be driven by the things that had happened to the characters in their lives. But also, I just did like brute research. So I would look up all like the top 20 games for that year. And then I would like try to look at them or visual to see them and to see exactly what their technical limitations were and what you could actually do with the game, say in 1997 versus what you could do with the game in 1999, and so it was just that process of looking for like particular references and then making them plug into what was happening in their lives and their biographies that would transform into these games.
So, Shannon, did anything surprise you? I mean, I remember having very early conversations about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow with you in the office, and our eyes were both the size of dinner plates, and we were walking around going, yeah. But did anything surprise you as you were reading?
I think, and Gabrielle, it's actually calling back to something you said earlier about it was seeing an evolution of a relationship with different types of tones across different people, where it didn't feel like a romance, but it felt really important and, more definitive of, I think, how a lot of relationships and modern relationships are evolving, where you can get different things from different people. And it's not one person that you have to be codependent on and rely on for everything. It's kind of growing and getting things from different people. And I see it so much in novels, but I haven't read one where it felt so modern. I think because of, honestly, some of the gaming setting and the setting in business, and it felt more personal to me because I could connect to different parts of it. So for me, that felt really unique, where I was like, oh, this is a different type of love story, where it can reflect how kind of we're evolving in relationships with our friends, just as we grow up together.
And I think I completely agree. And I think, what I have observed now that I'll be 45 this year, I think something I have observed is just that you can't guarantee what kind of love you're going to receive in life. So you can have love of work, maybe you have love of spouse, love of child, but the fact is we can't guarantee that we'll have all the kinds of loves, and we can't know exactly which love will be the most important one. And so I think I wanted to write about that, just people for whom the most important relationship in their lives are, their colleagues and their friends, and maybe some of their other relationships are not as important. Because if we can't see that about ourselves, it's difficult to, I think, truly embrace your life as it is. And some of that came from, the fact that I had written a modern love column. I hate writing personal essays, but you do it occasionally to promote a book. I'd written a modern love column called The Secret to Marriage is Never Getting Married. I did not come up with that title. I always want to tell people, but if you publish an article like that in the New York Times, they will say, people will immediately hate you. They'll say, you don't know the secret to anything. And literally, I don't know the secret to anything. I have no secrets of any kind. But, the article was about how I've been in this long relationship and we haven't married and we're still not married. And I wasn't saying that this is a way that anybody else should live their life, just the way I had lived their life. But the immediate responses to that article were that I couldn't know anything about life, about marriage, about love, or even kind of being a human being because I didn't yet have children. well, I was like 40 then, and children didn't seem like they were going to be showing up for me. And so it felt quite cruel to me because, I have the hand I have been dealt. I like my hands and I like my choices, and so I feel like I wanted to write about that in a book. And of course, this isn't Sam and Sadie's story, but the germ of that was maybe there in just this fact that we're all living different lives and they're not going to be the same ones. It's a complicated planet with complicated people in it. We shouldn't tell them that they don't know what love is because they don't have the life you have.
And as someone who also is not married to her person of 20 something years, yeah, you and I will have that conversation separately. But hey, Susan Berg is asking any chance of a movie or a miniseries?
Yes.
And she would prefer the miniseries.
It's funny. I thought it would be a mini series too, but then, people were quite interested in it for film as soon as the book was written, actually. And the people I liked the best were the ones that were wanting to make a film. And I think so much of this book is about collaboration and deciding who you want to be in the boat with for a long time. And so I picked the people I wanted to be in the boat with a long time. And we are making a movie. I have written a script. It was hard because it's like a long novel that takes place over a long period of time. As we mentioned, it was hard to kind of get all of these things in. And, I have great partners who are always like, can't we have that? Let's have that thing back in, and I'm like, guys, we can have that if it's going to be 3.5 hours. And then it starts to just be a mini series anyway. But no, so the process has been really fun so far of coming up with the movie. I think there's a good chance that there actually will be a movie. So I'm excited about that.
Oh, huzzah. Okay, Shannon, we're getting ready. We're really bumping up against time. Is there anything you want our audience to know today about tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow that we didn't maybe hit on? I mean, there's so much obviously to talk about in this book, but at the same time, some of it.
There's so much to unpack. And I think even on a second and third reading, the layers of callbacks to all the different parts of culture, how they interact with each other early, you get so much with the second reading of it, and it feels more special, and they're even that much more alive. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Gabrielle's other amazing books like AJ Fikry, that absolutely deserve to be read and devoured, because I think they're just, you hear when she talks, it's really speaking to life experience and how we interact with each other in our relationships. And what more could you want out of good fiction? So.
I'm good with that. Yeah. And that seems like a really good place to wrap a very cool event. I knew this was going to fly. I knew this was going to fly by. Oh. Gabrielle, it was so good to see you. It was so good to finally be able to talk about the things we couldn't talk about when we taped the show, because we always go spoiler free on Poured Over. And thank you everyone for joining. It's clear from the chat and the Q&A that you guys had big feelings about this book the way we had big feelings about this book. And hey, before I let you go, the next BNN Book Club title gets announced on Tuesday. So, hi, sorry to do that to you, but y'all get to wait until Tuesday, but it's excellent. It is so good. Anyway, thanks everyone. Have an awesome afternoon. This was so much fun. And, Gabrielle, Shannon, thank you so much as always.
Have a great day, you guys. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.